The choice of points of view from which the story is told is arguably the most important single decision that the novelist has to make, for it fundamentally affects the way readers will respond, emotionally and morally, to the fictional characters and their actions. Choosing a point of view is one of the first questions a writer must ask themselves. There are lots of examples that show how truly important this is to a novel. Just to give an example, crime fiction often has two options when it comes to a point of view. Do you have the criminal's perspective or the detective's? Well, it depends on what story you're telling. If you choose the criminal's perspective, it becomes a tense thriller about when they will be caught, whereas if you follow the detective, it will become a whodunit, to put it simply. But arguably, this idea of point of view is most important in retellings. There are many stories retelling events, mythologies, or other literature. This can be a modern retelling such as Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet or 10 Things I Hate About You, which are both retellings of Shakespeare plays in a modern setting. Or it can be a retelling from the perspective of a character we'd previously not heard from. This often culminates as a critique of the original text. Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys retells Jane Eyre from the perspective of Mr. Rochester's wife, also known as the Mad Woman in the Attic. The point of the retelling is to point out the racism and othering of immigrants in Victorian England. Mythology retellings have done similar critiques of the classical myths. This can be anything from queer erasure of Achilles to the lack of female voices in classics as a whole. The Penelopiad is a novel written by Margaret Atwood, a retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but from the perspective of Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who is talking from the afterlife, trying to reclaim her story. The reasons I bring this book up over other mythological retellings, which are equally critical of their original tales, is because this one specifically calls into question not just Odysseus' perspective, but also demands that the reader calls Penelope's perspective into question as well. This is a stance that I have yet to read, at least to this extent, but I'm sure there's one out there. Atwood uses different perspectives in order to show how no narrator is really reliable at all, as there is no objective truth in any situation. This synopsis will be as short as I can make it, as there are only a few key events you really need to understand for my analysis. This will be an overview of the story of the events told in the Penelopiad, but also will cover sections of the Iliad and the Odyssey as it is a retelling. So Penelope was the daughter of the Spartan king Icarus and cousin of Helen of Troy. In a competition for Penelope's hand, Odysseus of Ithaca wins by the help of Penelope's uncle. They marry. They have a son called Telemachus, but not long after, Helen of Troy is kidnapped by Paris and so the Trojan War begins. Odysseus had made an oath to Milanus, Helen's husband, and so sailed off to recruit Achilles and fight in the Trojan War. Penelope, obviously, was left behind and in charge of Ithaca. She continued her duties to the best she could. As the years passed, she heard of stories of Odysseus but still hadn't returned. As the heir to a huge fortune, there was a group of men known as the suitors who said that Odysseus was as good as dead and therefore Penelope needed to marry and then they would kill Telemachus. She gave an announcement that when she had finished weaving her shroud, she would choose her next husband. But every night, with the help of her maids, she undid her weaving so that she wouldn't have to choose a suitor. Penelope also sent the 12 maids to spy on them, where they were raped and manipulated by the suitors. Penelope forgave them and offered them comfort. When the suitors found out about the trick, Penelope promised to finish it quickly. Not long after, Odysseus arrived home, disguised as a beggar. Penelope pretended not to know who Odysseus is to protect his pride, so suggests an archery competition, which Odysseus easily wins. Penelope at the time was sleeping, likely drugged, when Odysseus and Telemachus killed the suitors and shortly after hanged the 12 maids. He then revealed himself to Penelope, who acted surprised, before he left on another adventure to cleanse himself after killing the suitors and the maids. After follows the trial of Odysseus in the afterlife, where he isn't punished for the death of the maids. In the afterlife, Penelope has never been able to talk to the maids. She occasionally sees Helen of Troy, who she still blames for the Trojan War and therefore all the deaths caused by it, including the 12 maids. She occasionally sees Odysseus at the end of his respective lives. He always chooses to be reborn into the world of the living, as the maids come after him, haunting him in both the underworld and on Earth. A retelling of anything is meta, as you have to relate it to one specific text continually. Metafiction is fiction about fiction, novels and stories that call attention to their fictional status and their compositional procedures. The Penelopiad is always in conversation with the original epic written by Homer, released between 725 and 675 BCE. Atwood's version of the events are written as a retrospective from the perspective of Penelope, as she is lacking agency in the epic. The conversation between the two sparks such interesting dialogue between the idea of legend and the truth and how neither really exists. Penelope in the novel is a strong and cunning character who is aware of the world around her. For example, when Odysseus returns to Ithaca disguised as a beggar, the original epic said that she didn't know it was him. However, this version of Penelope did, claiming that she knew the beggar was Odysseus. There was no coincidence, I set the whole thing up on purpose. So she's given agency comparatively to the epic, in which she isn't aware of Odysseus' disguise. Many critics of the Odyssey have pointed out how Penelope does not have any agency even though it impedes Odysseus' plot. This is mainly due to the classical idea that women, especially wives, were lesser than men. Penelope being in on the plot, as shown in the novel, helps Odysseus as she made the suitors do a challenge that she knew Odysseus could easily win. So the text is constantly talking and subtly criticising the epic and the portrayal of women. Naturally, the perspective enhances this as Penelope's sarcastic commentary shows how obviously she knew it was Odysseus. Furthermore, the narrator Penelope, for the most part of the novel, is speaking from the afterlife, many centuries after the epic was originally written and thereafter studied. So Penelope has witnessed what people have said both at the time of the epic's release, but also what has been said about it centuries later. In the same chapter, she says she hates the way people use her as a stick to beat women, and is used as a way to make women conform. She even goes on to say, "Don't follow my example, I want to scream in your ears." Pointing at people's reactions to the epic shows how the perspective of her character is warped. She doesn't want her image to be used in such a way, but if you look at her in the original classic by Homer, it appears as if she does want that. So not only does the theme contradict what this version of Penelope says, but also contradicts Homer's perspective. Not only is this criticising Homer and ancient Greece's perspectives of women, but also how we continue to use her as a stick in order to make women conform to an idealised wife. This couldn't be achieved if not for the meta nature of the novel, which is used to great effect, not only criticising Homer's epic, but also how we still respond to it, even now. This humanises Penelope. She becomes a well-rounded person from page 1, instantly going from Odysseus' wife to her own woman, showing how in reality there are no legends. Penelope isn't this perfect wife that women should want to be, and Odysseus isn't the legend everyone thinks of, at least from her perspective. The narrators of the story bring forth differing perspectives. For example, there are several chapters which are written from the maids' perspectives. One of these chapters, which is performed by the maids, tells of a rumour of how Penelope had to hide a suitor in her room as she had been sleeping with him. Penelope and Euryclea? Sorry, I probably butchered that. Odysseus' wet nurse discusses how they will put the blame on the maids so that Penelope's adultery can be covered up. The chapter ends with the chorus, "Blame it on the maids, those naughty little jades, hang them high and don't ask why, blame it on the maids," clearly showing who the maids blame for their hanging, even though this is said to be a rumour. Later in the novel, Euryclea claims that they let it go to their heads. It wouldn't have done for the king Odysseus to allow such impertinent girls to continue to serve in the palace. He could never have trusted them. So clearly there is some overlap between the two perspectives. Both versions of events could be true. Penelope is trying to vindicate herself and so wouldn't admit to any wrongdoing, and likewise the maids have strong reasoning as to why they would blame Penelope. So this choice of conflicting narrators creates tensions between these two narratives the novel is telling, as they are not mutually exclusive. Therefore, both the maids and the Penelope's perspectives are questioned by the reader and the novel itself. Furthermore, Penelope is an unreliable narrator. The point of an unreliable narrator is to reveal in an interesting way the gap between appearance and reality, and to show how human beings distort or conceal the latter. Penelope does this throughout the book. In the first chapter, when she decides to tell her story, she says so by saying, "It's my turn to do a little story making." She admits even to herself that she's telling a story, not the truth. So how is the reader supposed to know what is reality and just her story? They don't, and that's kind of the point. The blurred lines between reality and the story are completely intentional, so that we are meant to question what we have been told about the Odyssey, but also the Penelopiad, and as both are perspective-based in many respects. Another key component in exploring the nature of perspective is context, as this determines how a text is shaped. One of the ways in which the novel and the epic differ is the portrayal of women. For example, during Homer's time, women were seen as lesser, especially servant or slave girls, whereas now you would hope that we have moved past this perspective and come to understand that women are not lesser than men. Atwood uses well-known stereotypes of women and uses them to show how the perspectives of women haven't changed till recently. The fallen woman, for example, is used to great effect to point out how women are often blamed for the actions of men. Fallen woman is a term which came to popularity in the 19th century and is often used to describe a woman who has fallen from grace and lost her innocence. Usually this was specifically about women who had sexual relations outside of marriage. These women were often not doing anything that men had not done, but this label meant that your reputation in life was ruined, as no man would want to marry a ruined woman. The Penelopiad's characters often characterised the maids as this, as a way to excuse the murder of these 12 women. When describing which maids had been hanged, Euryclea called them notorious whores. Odysseus had described the girls as disloyal. They weren't given any time to defend themselves. Penelope couldn't defend them as she was asleep at the time of the hanging and chose not to tell after, as Odysseus could have suspected her of disloyalty as well. This tells us that these girls were seen as fallen, as they were no longer maids or girls, they were disloyal whores, even though they were raped. Later in the novel, Odysseus is put on trial in the afterlife for the deaths of the 12 maids. This trial takes place thousands of years after the original events, as the attorney for the defence claims the events took some place between 3,000 or 4,000 years before my time, and therefore we can't say exactly what happened. This trial is meant to be in a modern setting and therefore modern thinking in regards to women. However, the judge ultimately dismisses the case as he claims it would be unfortunate if this regrettable but minor incident were allowed to stand as a blot on an otherwise exceedingly distinguished career. He dismisses the case to save Odysseus' reputation rather than seeking out real justice. This speaks to a trend that is seen in our modern age, where women are discouraged from reporting rape and/or sexual assault cases as to not destroy a man's reputation. RAINN, the largest anti-rape organisation in the US, claims that only 310 out of every 1,000 sexual assaults are reported to police. That means that more than 2 out of 3 go unreported. So whilst women are no longer being hanged for rape, there is still a lack of justice. From this perspective, the story becomes about their injustice, whereas in the Odyssey it is a good idea to kill the maids. So contextually, this shows how the maids face the real injustice, not Odysseus and not Penelope. The heartbreaking truth of this novel is that Penelope can show her reasoning and explain everything she did, but ultimately she is just justifying herself for not helping the maids, as much as Odysseus is shown to be justified for killing the maids. All in all, Penelope is in some way just as guilty. This is the true story of the Penelopiad. No matter how hard Penelope tries, she will always either have no agency or be completely complicit in the murder of the 12 maids. This book, in many ways, is heartbreaking. The final chapter of the novel is a poem spoken by the maids. They say how they will follow Odysseus after he is reincarnated. They end the novel by sprouting wings and flying away as owls. The novel is profound in many ways, especially how it seems to make Penelope seemingly innocent and guilty. She is responsible for what happened to the maids, but also blames others for this. She first blames Odysseus and then Helen of Troy. This lends itself to the idea that she is just telling a story, one that comforts her from her guilt. The only times we see her outside of her own perspective, she is overcome with guilt. We have to call into question Penelope's perspective as a guilty party. She points out all the ways throughout the book how there is no truth or objectivity, and her perspective only proves this further. This is seen throughout Atwood's work. She is constantly playing with our idea of perspective and how we read a novel. The Penelopiad speaks to the guilt that women face, especially when they are the cause of injustice towards women. Penelope in both the real world, as a way to make women conform, and the fictional one, where she led 12 maids to their death.